Sure. Sure. Nice of you.
Nice to meet you.
Professor, as you see, Maruyama has also joined from Japan.
Okay, very good. Yeah.
Hello, Yasushi.
Hello, very nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you after a long time. Yes. Good to see you here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the, first meeting.
Yes.
Conference for
Yes.
Tractatus.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Next month, Professor Ferdinand will be speaking. So we have decided that every month one speaker. That is how
Okay.
we will proceed. Yes. So, sir, shall we begin?
Yeah, let's begin.
We'll just wait for a minute and then maybe.
Yeah.
Professor Jyotirmoy Tripathi has joined. Welcome, Jyoti bhai.
Thanks, Professor Panda. Good to be here.
Namaskar.
Namaste, namaste.
So, good afternoon, all of you who have joined the meeting today on this August occasion. Today is Onam, is one of the cultural festival of Kerala. So happy Onam to all of you. Many of our friends are from Kerala, so we are wishing happy Onam. It is a cultural festival in the southern India. Friends, today we are going to begin a new series of lectures on Tractatus. As you all know, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is one of the classics was in contemporary in 20th century philosophy, and this particular text has completed almost completed 100 years. So we are organizing a centenary lecture on Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus. This lecture series will continue from today's talk till the July 2022. So we will have 12 lectures in this series. We are also planning some other activities in this forum. Forum had those who are new to this study circle. Forum has been working informally as a study group, and during the last year we had a lecture series on Sankhya Yoga, philosophy of consciousness. We had almost 8 lectures under that series. Now this series will have, as I said, 12 lectures, and all those speakers, distinguished speakers, are listed in our website. It is a newly made website. We have not developed it fully, but their names do appear there with their affiliations. Today's speaker is Professor Ramesh Chandra Pradhan. Professor Pradhan is one of the well-known Wittgensteinian in India. He has written 3 books on Wittgenstein and edited one book called Philosophy of Wittgenstein, Indian Perspective. Now, I would like to introduce the speaker briefly. Professor Pradhan is a professor of philosophy, retired from University of Hyderabad. He had a long career of teaching in philosophy. He started his career from Utkal University in 1978 and joined Dharwad University in 1983. After that, from 1987 onwards, he was associated with University of Hyderabad and retired in 2015 from the University of Hyderabad. Now, during his tenure, he was also a Commonwealth Academic Staff Fellow from 1991-92 at Oxford University. He was Member Secretary, Indian Council of Philosophical Research from 2000 to 2003. He was National Fellow recently at Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Simla, from 2018 to 2020. Some of the important works, as I said, he had 3 books on Wittgenstein. The first book was one of his early works, the PhD work, that is Language and Experience, an interpretation of the letter Wittgenstein, letter philosophy of Wittgenstein, that was published in 1981. Then he had a couple of other books in analytic philosophy, such as Truth, Meaning, and Understanding, and linguistic meaning and representation. Apart from those 2 books, The Great Mirror, Essays in Wittgenstein's Tractatus, was published in 2002, and later it is again reprinted in 2007 by Kalki publication, New Delhi. The other work is Language, Reality, and Transcendence, an essay on the main strands of Wittgenstein's philosophy, 2008. And some of the recent works are Metaphysics of Consciousness, The Indian Vedantic Perspective in 2020, published by Springer. Early Philosophy of Daya is the latest book published this year by Springer, 2021. So these are some of the important works of Professor Pradhan. He has taught many of us who are present here Wittgenstein. We all studied with him, and now after many years, again we will be revisiting some of the ideas of Wittgenstein, and I am sure we all will learn and have a great opportunity to listen to him today. With these few words, I invite Professor Pradhan to deliver his talk. The title of his talk is From Symbolism to Silence, Understanding Wittgenstein Tractatus, a Tribute. So over to Professor Pradhan.
Thank you, Ranjan, for your very nice, generous introduction. And also thank you for inviting me to speak as the inaugural speaker of the new series that you have very wisely starting from this month. It is really a great privilege to not only to speak to this audience, but also it is a privilege to revisit the Tractatus again after a long gap of time. Tractatus, it is needless to say, is very dear to me, as it is also dear to all of you. So it is really a great pleasure to speak today on the topic from symbolism to silence. It was very correctly said that the publication of the Tractatus was a great event of the 20th century in the world of philosophy. This is true because in the last 100 years, Tractatus has never lost its eminence in the scholarly world. So as you have rightly pointed out, it is a classic in the Western philosophy. Why Western philosophy? In philosophy as such. So in that sense, we are really privileged to celebrate the 100th year of the publication of the Tractatus. I hope that I will try to bring out something which may not be very new, but which could be stimulating, and I will be very happy to answer your queries and questions at the end of the lecture. Let me begin with a few words about the Tractatus itself. As a text, as I can see, it belongs to the critical tradition, as Wittgenstein himself called it the critique of language. So if some other name would have been given instead of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, it could have been perhaps the critique of language. But anyway, that is only a matter of our interpretation. And secondly, this also belongs to, as I can understand, to a distinctly Western tradition called the transcendental tradition in philosophy. Of course, it goes back to Kant, carried forward through Schopenhauer and many others. So it is a distinct tradition in the West and in the East as well. Therefore, this text belongs to the transcendental critical tradition. Thereby, I do not want to foreclose the possibility of other interpretations. Somebody could trace it out to the empiricist tradition in the British philosophical, as a part of the British philosophical tradition. Or it could be also traced to the Austrian, because Wittgenstein was an Austrian philosopher, to the Austrian empiricist tradition. But in any way, these are different ways of approaching the Tractatus, but I will approach the Tractatus through the prism of the critical transcendental tradition in the history of Western philosophy. Tractatus, therefore, occupies the place in which perhaps many traditions could be intertwined, or many traditions could meet, such as the linguistic tradition or analytic tradition, and which was initiated by Frege and then Russell. So there is the dominance of logic in the Tractatus itself, in the text itself. Therefore, it is, in a sense, a treatise on logic and philosophy, as the meaning of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is. Then we can see that many kinds of thought have crisscrossed in the text. One strong influence can be traced to Schopenhauer, on whom we'll listen to Professor Eli, the next speaker. Sorry to mispronounce, our next speaker. So that is also one of the notable points. And obviously, the influence of Kant could not be ruled out, though Wittgenstein is not very explicit on Kant. But as I said, it belongs to the critical tradition. Therefore, Kant could not be forgotten while understanding the Tractatus. So in a sense, I will try to understand the Tractatus from this predominantly transcendental point of view, transcendental critical point of view. In that sense, I will keep in mind the two ends of the text. One, the significant declaration on the nature of language and the world, and the same text declaration that we must also keep something about which we cannot speak. That means there is a large space for silence. So the mystery of silence I will try to understand later. So I will develop my discussion at these stages. First I will focus on, though in brief, on the symbolism or the symbolic representation of the world. Second, about the nature of the world. And the third, I will come back to the limit question, which Wittgenstein is raising in his philosophical discussion on the nature of language and the world. So the limit question, which is a very, very important question that he has raised. And lastly, I will come back to the domain of silence, that is the mystical. And as I can understand, mystical is the most enigmatic part of the Tractatus. So in a positive way, I will focus on the mystical without dismissing it out of hand, nor in a sense further mystifying it. I'll try to sort out the implications of being mystical. Anyway, so this is the way I will proceed. Let us come back to the notion of symbolism. Why symbolism, or why the notion of language is important, that we must understand. Wittgenstein could not have written a book only on what he calls the zone of silence, unless he develops a theory of language and raises the question of the limit of language. He could not have felt the necessity of there being something mystical. So in that sense, raising the question of language is a must for him. And secondly, as a thinker, he is coming after, means intellectually after Frege and Russell, in the sense that long before Tractatus is really written out and published, its writing started around 1914, or much before that, 1913, 12. Actually, his philosophical thinking started from 1912, but it crystallized in so many years. By the time he entered into the war zone, he was still writing on it. Therefore, it was developing on a long period of time, from notebooks to proto-Tractatus to Tractatus proper. There is a continuous development. And as we shall come back to some of the ideas which have evolved in Wittgenstein's, let us call the early philosophy, or the philosophy of the Tractatus. Let us come to the question of language. Now, already before him, there has been established a logical tradition initiated by Frege and Russell, in which for understanding language and the world, we have to go through a logical method. We have to apply a logical method. So the question of a logical syntax and logical semantics was very much round the corner. Frege had developed a logical syntax, a logical system, though he was least interested in the ordinary language and not much in metaphysics at all. Frege had initiated the logical movement, which is called formal logic and or symbolic logic, and therefore Wittgenstein Tractatus is indebted to Frege. And Wittgenstein has himself admitted in his introduction, in his preface of the book, his great indebtedness to Frege and Russell. That secondly, though he came in contact with Russell, Russell's logic had impacted him in a sense, but not his empiricistic approach to philosophy. And if any two philosophers diverged or disagreed from each other more than any other two philosophers are Russell and Wittgenstein. They differed so much. But yet, Russell had to write an introduction to the Tractatus, which Wittgenstein did not approve of, though he accepted pragmatically for the sake of publication of the work. Anyway, we'll not go into the Russell-Wittgenstein debate. In our discussion, it will come, perhaps. Now, let us come to the question of language. Which language he was really interested in? This is a question which is uppermost in our mind. He was not interested in any language other than the natural language. As he admits, natural language is the one which is given to us, and it is the one which philosophy has to understand. His idea of philosophy really begins with the idea of a critique of language, that language must critique this, philosophy must critique this language, the language which is naturally given. But why should it be critiqued? Because there is much inclarity and there is much presence of what he calls the meaninglessness in language itself. There are nonsensical sentences in language. Perhaps he meant the classical metaphysical sentences. But anyway, that is one of the reasons why he wanted to critique this language. And secondly, second point is that language itself has a logical structure. And as a logician and as a philosopher, he was interested in the logical structure of language. And that's why he, instead of developing a logical system on its own, as Frege did, he applied the logical system to language, to understanding of language. So the truth functional structure of logic, he straight away applied to the to natural language in order to find out what could be the logical form of language or the logical structure of language. So that itself shows that his influence, the influence of Frege and the logician Russell was so much that he could not be free from the logical spectacles which he wore for understanding the nature of language itself. This is perhaps why in the later philosophical works, he had to go slightly away from this logical understanding of language or the understanding of the logic of language. That's why, as we know, that the later philosophy stands sometimes in a contrast with the earlier work. But that is only part of the story, not the whole of the story. But anyway, when he comes to the nature of language, he finds that perhaps the only way we can understand language is through the propositions. And therefore, he talked about the elementary propositions or atomic propositions and their functional combinations, which yield all the stock of propositions in language. He could map out the logical formations within language or the logical sentential formations within language by talking about the elementary or atomic propositions. But anyway, this is of interest only to those who will say that Tractatus is only concerned with logic, and therefore they can spend a lot of time in understanding why atomic propositions were so important for him. At least I will not go into the details of it, precisely because my interest is elsewhere. Because I want to suggest why Wittgenstein really was moving away from this propositional structure of language within the Tractatus itself. We didn't have to go to the philosophical investigations to know why he was so much not happy with the very propositional structure of language. He knew that this is only a limited structure of language, and that structure was very important for him so far as understanding the world was concerned. And he could find an easy passage from the truth functional structure of language to the nature or the structure of the factual world. So let me come back to the second point, that is the nature of the world. As we can see, Tractatus is so much concerned with in the early part of it, at least up to fifth, the section fifth, under the numerical system of 5 and its commentaries and some commentaries, all of them are concerned with, in some way or other, with logic and language. So, and in the very beginning itself, he is suggesting about the nature of the world. The world is all that is the case. That these tractatus begins with that profound statement: the world is all that is the case. So, in a sense, his interest was also in the world. That's why propositional logic or propositional structure of language was very much an easy instrument for him to understand the world. Therefore, he could join with many other philosophers of his time in understanding the world in terms of facts and its constituents, that is, objects. So one can think that he is really interested in the world as any empiricist is, or any naturalist is, or any scientific-minded philosopher is. But as we can see later on, that was his interest in the world was only a stepping stone towards understanding something more than the world. That is what he really wanted to tell us, and this we'll discuss when we come to the limit question. What sort of world he was really talking about? The Tractatus is very clear that we are concerned, if we are concerned with a natural language, we are basically concerned with the factual world, a natural world, a world that is given. But this given world itself is so much thick in terms of its logicality, in terms of its being pervaded by logic, that we cannot understand this world unless we understand language itself, and therefore indirectly unless we understand logic itself. Because logic and language both are conspiring, or both are in hand to understand the world. So therefore he brings logic into the center stage of his philosophical investigation, that is philosophical inquiry into the nature of the world. The world itself is linguistically thick. It is covered by language in that sense. And therefore you cannot have a world which is pre-given, which is given as such in the so-called sense data, as the empiricists thought. But actually this world is already a logically structured world. Therefore he says the world is all that is the case, and the world consists of facts and not of objects. That the whole idea goes on. This is precisely because you cannot understand the world unless you understand the structure of language, which is a representation of the world. Here the idea of the mirror comes, the idea of representation comes, and language, along with logic, happens to be for him a great mirror in which you can see the whole of the world, which world, that is the factual world. So the fact embedded world, or the fact structured world, is the only world that we can really, we are concerned with language. But that didn't prevent him from talking of possible worlds, because the combination of objects which constitute the state of affairs could constitute possible worlds. So that angle we also cannot wish away. We cannot wish away, because possible worlds could be logically structured. But he was concerned with the actual world as he was concerned with the natural language. But as a logician, as a philosopher of language, he could not really give up the idea that when he's talking about the world, he's also talking about the logical possibility of the world. That is what really comes to my mind when I say that his understanding of the world again was being conditioned by his understanding of logic and language. Therefore, this is in a sense, a transcendental approach to the world. Though he was searching for the structure of the world, that was only in terms of the logical structure. So therefore, the a priori structure of the empirical world, the natural world. So in that sense, he was not an empiricist, he was a transcendental thinker about the world. This world, he did not think that it was a created world. He didn't believe in personal God. In that sense, he didn't accept the creation theory of the Christian thinkers. So in that sense, there was no created world. It is a world which is there, and philosopher has to understand it and understand in terms of logic and language. And in that sense, if you are searching for the logical possibilities of the world, the logical structure of the world, the logical condition of the world, then you are really, in a sense, you are posing the question as Kant would have posited the question in his Critique of Pure Reason, in a transcendental sense. How is the world possible? So that could have been the question that he would have raised. But he begins with the assertion that the world is all that is the case. And that perhaps is a philosophical statement, not an empirical statement. The world is all that is the case. So as a philosopher, he's saying that the world is the factual world. But anyway, coming back to the nature of the world itself, he's also reminding us of the fact that the world is pervaded by logic. Logic pervades the world. That is a famous statement. What does it mean when we say that logic pervades the world? And logic is not a, yes, logic is the mirror image of the world. That is another famous statement. Logic is not a body of doctrines, but the mirror image of the world. So these are certain statements, very pregnant statements, which suggest us that he's giving us a transcendental account of the world. That's why he calls logic is transcendental. And perhaps he could have said the critique of language that he is proposing is also transcendental critique. As he says, it is a critique of language not in Mauthner's sense. And Mauthner was a philosopher who was an empiricist, and his critique of language was an empiricist critique. Therefore, he is dissociating himself from the empirical tradition. So he is suggesting a transcendental tradition, transcendental way of understanding the world. So in that sense, his understanding of world must be such that we need not take him as one who is inquiring into the world as an empiricist or as a naturalist. He is inquiring into the logical structure of the world, and that sums up his idea of a metaphysics of the world. If we can talk of a metaphysics of the world, he will not mind calling it a metaphysics of the world, because he is really talking about the world and its logical structure. He cannot be straightforwardly called an atomist. Generally, it is called logical atomism, but I doubt if we can really be called logical atomism. Russell's logical atomism was a part of his empiricist understanding of the world, and Wittgenstein's was not an empiricist account. As a transcendental account, he's talking about the world, and that is definitely, in a sense, he's talking of a holistic approach to the world. It is not an atomistic approach to the world. That perhaps is one of the wrong impressions which has been given by the commentators, by the interpreters, but this could be one interpretation. Look at the first sentence, the world is all that is the case. That is a statement which appears to be more holistic than atomistic. And it is the world consists of facts, not of objects. Therefore, he is not atomist in that sentence also. So in that sense, he is taking us away from so-called atomism and taking us, asking us to take as a holistic view of the world. The world is a limited whole. That is the expression he makes elsewhere. The world is a limited whole. So in that sense, if it is a limited whole, then it is not necessarily atomistic in structure. Though we could divide the world into its objects, but where are the objects? accepting in the whole structure of the world. The objects themselves are part of a whole system. So in that sense, we can go forward by suggesting that it is not atomism that is this singular problem in the tractate. Secondly, was he a realist? This is the question which is uppermost in the minds of many commentators. Many say yes, he was a realist, because he was talking about the world as if he is talking about the world as a realist, that the proposition is true if and only if the fact is there corresponding to it. So one can easily say that he's holding a correspondence theory of truth. And his idea of picture theory is nothing but a reassertion of the correspondence theory of truth. But as I can see that he's looking at the world through the prism of language. If he's looking at the world through the prism of language, then he cannot be called a realist. But a realist will be one who thinks that the world determines the propositions, the truth of the propositions. That means truth is dependent on the world. But if you are looking through language and logic, the logical structure of language in that sense, the world structure is mirrored in the logical structure of language, then you are imposing perhaps willy-nilly a logical structure on the world. That's why he says the world is pervaded by logic. If world is pervaded by logic, is he not reminding us that it is more idealism in his thought than realism, which should be noted? So that is a matter of debate. We'll perhaps many discussion in future also come to this question: was he a realist or an idealist? At least a transcendental idealist, that is what I can hazard a guess about it. Of course, that is a matter of interpretation. If logic is transcendental, if the critique of language is transcendental, then our understanding of the world is conditioned by logical structure of language. And therefore, it is more an idealistic account of the world than allow him to do. That is why here he raises the question of limit of language. The idea of limit, only a critical philosopher can raise. And it was Kant who raised the question of limit of thought, limit of knowledge. So in that sense, basically Kant was concerned with the limits of empirical knowledge. So in a critical tradition, it is very pertinent to have the question of limit. That is, Wittgenstein is now ready to admit that our natural language has a limit that is, has a boundary which, as philosophers concerned with language and world, must not cross. That is, within a certain framework, we are not allowed to go beyond the limits of this language, and also the limits of the world, because the limits of language are coterminous with the limits of the world. That is, the structure of language is coterminous with the structure of the world. That is, these two structures are basically identical. The world and language have the same logical form, and therefore one logical form could be understood in both in terms of language and the world. There is a thick relationship between the language and the world. So in that sense, the limits of language will be the same as the limits of the world. Here the question arises, and which he raises in the preface itself. That is, why should philosophers be concerned with the limits of language? Philosophers or philosophy must set a limit to language so that many things which we cannot talk about must be passed over in silence. That is, he is aware of the fact that this language, that is logically structured natural language, is not capable of expressing many things which a philosopher ought to express but cannot express in language, then the question of the limit of language becomes relevant. And once the survey or the logical survey of language is over, language and the world is over, then perhaps as a philosopher, as a transcendental philosopher, you can well say that this language has a limit. And this world, which is reflected in this language, which is mirrored, represented in this language or pictured in this language, must also be limited. By raising the question of limit, Wittgenstein is hinting on the idea that there are many more things which philosophy can be concerned about, but due to the strictures, due to the restricted domain of language and logic, he cannot, by his own philosophical concerns, talk about. What is that philosophical concerns which bars him from talking about something which language cannot really express or language cannot really talk about? This is the question which is paramount in his tractatus. That's why he raises the question of the limits of language and reality, or language and the world. When he defines philosophy, he also makes a very bold statement that the job of philosophy is to make things, the ideas clear, and the philosophy also delimits the sphere of sciences, the natural sciences, and therefore, in a sense, it delimits the area in which we can clearly say what we can say. Since language is an instrument of saying, language is an instrument of saying everything clearly about the world. Therefore, this is the model which he must adopt as a philosophical model, that we must speak clearly. Whatever we want to speak, we must speak clearly. So he is, in a sense, taking the responsibility, philosophical responsibility on himself, not to go beyond the boundary of the world and beyond the boundary of language, because he says that beyond this language, our speaking of things clearly will be jeopardized. Therefore, we must draw the limit to language. Language must be confined to its own sphere, where we can talk about the factual world, we can talk about the logical structure of language and the logical structure of the world. We can make everything clear as anything could be. But even then, this language and this world would not be our final destination. No, as a philosopher, he doesn't want to confine himself to being a philosopher of language and the world, because he wants to see the limits of both language and the world. So this is the limit question that I wanted to raise. It is the limit question which is more important for him. In a letter to a friend, he wrote that the tractatus has two parts. One part is that which is written, and the other which is unwritten. And he says it is the unwritten part which is more important than the written part. So we can paraphrase his thought by saying that if we do logic and language and understanding of the world in philosophy, that is not enough, because that only gives us a very limited view of everything. That means we are not wiser by understanding the nature of language. We are not any wiser by understanding the nature of the factual world. We are not any wiser by understanding logic itself. We are wiser if we can go beyond this boundary, beyond this logic. Though apparently philosophy doesn't allow him to go beyond. As a logician, he is bound. As a philosopher of language, he is bound. But as a transcendental philosopher, he is not bound. Therefore, he says that beyond the limits of language, beyond what can be said or the sayable, there are things which cannot be said. And that is what he calls the ineffable. And that is what he calls the mystical. That means he is taking responsibility of himself. Of course, on this, many commentators will disagree. That there is nothing beyond the limits of language. And that many will say that that has been clarified in the preface itself, that everything that goes beyond language is meaningless. So meaninglessness is a threat, in a sense, for a logician. Meaninglessness is a threat to a philosopher of language. That's why the logical positivists were happy when they heard Wittgenstein, and personally they contracted him, that he was very nice in condemning metaphysics, because that was the agenda of the positivist. Wittgenstein must not have agreed with them, as he says that he doesn't want to meet. He openly declared because that he doesn't want to meet Carnap, because Carnap was very anti-metaphysical, and he was very happy with the logical positivist, other logical positivist, but he was not happy with the hardcore positivist, that is Carnap. Anyway, that is only to suggest that he was not shying away the fact that there is a domain of what cannot be said. Why did he use the word mystical 3 times in the Tractatus and 1 time in the notebooks? In the notebooks, there is only 1 in the index for mystical, or the German word mystische, but 3 times in the Tractatus. It was because he was convinced by the time he came to publish the Tractatus that the Tractatus had a different orientation altogether. Though it was a Tractatus logico-philosophicus, it was really more logico-philosophicus ethicus. That means its orientation was ethical, moral, and perhaps we can add spiritual, which I will justify later. That means he was committed to the idea that the Tractatus doesn't end with logic and language, and therefore doesn't end with the analysis of the structure of the world. It goes beyond. He suggests that we have only discussed the condition of the world, how a world is possible. But beyond that, there are many things which by analysis of the world we may not understand. By solving all scientific questions, as he said in one statement, we have now solved the problem of life. That means by understanding all the factual questions about the world, the scientific questions of the world, and understanding the whole of science of the world, the science of language and the science of logic, we have not solved the problem of life. So that shows that he was more committed to the problems of life than to the problems of logic and language. Therefore, a distinct philosophy of life was emerging in the Tractatus. And that is what the mystical is all about, and that we shall discuss in brief. That's why he suggests that, for example, all the sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, he's concerned with the logic and language. But as soon as 6 comes, and 7, of course, is the only one statement section, all that we can speak about, all that we cannot speak about must be passed over in silence. So that statement apart, in the 6th, he comes to the philosophy of life. Therefore, the number 6 is so important for understanding the Tractatus. Rather, we can go from back to the front to understand the Tractatus. Instead of from the beginning to the end, rather we can come from the end to the beginning, and we can understand the Tractatus better. So there he is very clear that certain things, though he says it is unsayable, remember, he is saying about it. As a philosopher, he is bound to say about the unsayable. He has to express the mystical. As he says, mystical is ineffable, but it is shown. It can show itself. So that which cannot be said is shown. So there he opens up the domain of the mystical to a philosophical eye, of course, not to a logician or a philosopher of language, because it is open to one who is concerned with ethics, one who is concerned with religion, and one who is concerned with metaphysics. That's why I can say that he has a metaphysics of the silence. He has a metaphysics of the mystical. He has a metaphysics of the unsayable. And he is committed very much not only to the possibility of the realm of the unsayable, but also the reality of the realm of the unsayable. Let us find out what are the things he wants to put in the realm of the silence, or the realms in the realm of the mystical. First comes to his mind is ethics. He says, our language cannot express anything that is higher. Therefore, there cannot be propositions of ethics. Look at his boldness. He's saying there cannot be propositions of ethics. Whereas Moore in 1905 or 1903 has written already a Principia Ethica. Therefore, Wittgenstein somewhere says, why has he written such a voluminous book on ethics? Why? That means he's wondering how ethics can express that which is higher, that which is transcendental, that which is concerned with the good and the happy life. How can you express? And even if you express, what can you express? When you express the transcendental, if you express the transcendental, you can only express in the non-transcendental mode of thinking. That which is unsayable, if you say it, you can only say nonsense. You can say good is indefinable. So he will say what Moore is doing. He's substituting one nonsensical statement with another nonsensical statement. Good is indefinable. Therefore, he says good cannot be defined, cannot be expressed. It must be passed over in silence. We must realize what good is. Remember, good is sown. Cannot be said, but it can be sown. Goodness of life can be sown in life itself, and happiness of life can be sown in happiness itself. So there is no necessity of expressing what cannot be expressed in language, especially in a language which is circumscribed by certain natural conditions, like the human conditions. So in that sense, he is keeping ethics out of the boundary of language and putting it in the boundary of the silence. That means he is not taking away ethics. He is not denying ethics. He is not skeptical about ethics. He's saying good is there and that is the highest good one must pursue. And that's why he says, what is happy life? He says happy life is the life of knowledge. Such statements you will find in the notebooks more clearly than in the tractatus. But ethics is something is so prized, so valuable for him that he cannot allow the logician, the so-called philosopher of language, to dabble in it. So he keeps it as a transcendental domain. Ethics becomes transcendent. Then comes to the notion of religion. He has a great respect for religion, as we know. On religion, he was never reticent, though in life he never was not supporter of any organized religion. He had no respect for the organized religion. But he was essentially a religious person, as many commentators have also found out, that he looked at the problems from a religious point of view. That means religion was very dear to his heart. Religiousness was very dear to his heart. Whether he was a believer in God or not, that is a matter of debate. But he did say in the Tractatus that God doesn't reveal himself in the world. This shows that he says that God is a transcendental reality, the highest being, the supreme being, though he didn't believe that he was a creator God, but a supreme being he did accept, and he says it is not revealed in the world. That means world is too limited to reveal the supreme being, the supreme reality. And on this, he's more explicit in the notebooks about the meaning of God. Somewhere he says world and God are the same. This is a pantheistic statement, but in the Tractatus, he somehow or other suppresses his pantheism, but goes for a transcendental concept of God, that God doesn't reveal himself in the world. Secondly, he says to think about God, to pray to God is to think about the meaning of the world. So in that sense, in a sense, God and the meaning of the world have been identified. But those statements are in the notebooks. They are not kept in the Tractatus. Tractatus is more reticent about God. When he says everything that is higher cannot be expressed in language, thereby he suggests that religion also cannot be talked about. Sorry?
Sir, for some time I got disconnected.
Okay.
Now you please carry on. Yes.
Okay. Now I am audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So religion also is an area, a transcendental theory of religion. We can say that he has a transcendental view of religion, and that religion also is kept under the purview of the mystical. Third point, which I must mention, which can qualify to be the mystical, is the world as a limited whole. That means if you look at the world sub specie eternitatis from a transcendental point of view, from the eternity point of view, then the world will appear, or world is a limited whole. This feeling of the world as a limited whole is really something mystical, cannot be expressed in words. That means this is a way of understanding the world which you can feel, which you can grasp, perhaps intuitively, which can be shown, but it cannot be expressed in language. Another idea which also he talks about and which cannot be expressed at all, which is cannot be said, is the existence of the world itself. Now, we can talk about the world, about its facts, objects, etc., but the existence of the world itself is something unsaid. That the world exists, this is mystical. Not what the world is, that is not mystical. Not how the world is, that is not mystical, but what the world is, that is mystical. That is, the existence of the world itself is mystical. So that is the being of the world itself cannot be expressed in language, because everything else presupposes the being of the world. Even our language, our logic, our own existence presupposes the being of the world. And that must be a transcendental fact about the world which cannot be expressed in language. Only that which can refer to a fact in the world, in the actual world, that can be expressed, and not that which is a transcendental fact or a metaphysical fact about the world. The being of the world, the existence of the world can be disclosed, as Heidegger has also expressed it in a different way, that being can be disclosed. So in this sense, Wittgenstein is also saying that being cannot be talked about, being of the world cannot be talked about, it must be disclosed. It can show itself rather than it can be talked about. Now coming back to the notion of the mystical itself, another ontological reality which could be outside the boundary of language is the notion of self. The self itself is outside the world. That is the famous statement he makes. If I write a book, the world as I find it, then everything about my body, about my desire, about my psychology, I can mention it, but not about myself. So the self is outside the boundary of the world and therefore outside the boundary of language. So on the notion of the self itself, we can have long discussion, but within this short span, I just mentioned that he has a transcendental notion of self, which he places outside the boundary of the world. And that really gives enough scope for understanding why he wants to keep silent about the nature of the self itself. Though he makes statements about the self, but the self itself cannot be expressed. It is not that self is unknowable, but it is only unsayable. And we must make a distinction between unknowability and unsayability. It is simply, we can say, mystical. Coming to the conclusion, now we are nearing the time. What is the place of silence is in the Tractatus? Though he talks about the silence twice in the preface and at the end of the Tractatus, but silence itself is so pregnant, is so vociferous, is so significant in his framework. Silence he wants to introduce, not to escape the fundamental questions relating to life, relating to religion, ethics, self, value, etc., not to escape the questions, but to find a better way of understanding them. The better way of understanding is by not talking about it in our logico-linguistic structures. Our symbolism is incapable. So symbolism has a limit, but human capacity for thinking, human capacity for realizing, human capacity for feeling, human capacity for intuiting, if we can add this word later on, is unlimited. So if the language is finite, if the world is world is finite, since it has a limit, so we can take it as a finite world, but there is the infinity of, say, the Supreme Being, the infinity of, let's say, the infinite nature of the being itself, that cannot be expressed in language. So language in that sense forces us, if this is the language that we have, then it forces us to be confined within its limits. But as philosophers, as transcendental thinkers, we cannot but open up the realm of the mystical, the realm of the silence, the metaphysical realm of the most valuable, the most important in life, and the most important in our reflection on existence, on reality. So there is, as Wittgenstein will gladly say, there is much that we must be silent about, though philosophically we cannot but think about it, we cannot but get as much illumination as we can get it about it. So though he's admittedly saying that perhaps we will be talking nonsensical statements, we will be making nonsensical statements, he said, doesn't matter. Let us not be cowed down by our language, and let us get away from the prison house of language. Then we can see the reality as it is. That's why the ladder example becomes important. After understanding about everything about logic, language, and the world, we can throw this ladder. After we climb it up, we throw the ladder, then we can see the reality as it is. And perhaps that is the statement of a visionary, that not a statement of a logician or a philosopher of language, not an empiricist, not a naturalist. Perhaps a visionary thinker is there and is telling us in so many words that look beyond your language, look beyond this world also. So with these words, I conclude my discussion. I will be very happy if you raise questions and give your feedback to my discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And I think you touched almost all important points of Tractatus, right from the logical language, where you talked about symbolism and how logic has its own limit. Then you spoke about the world, the ontology of world and how we need to see the world and its being from a transcendental perspective. And you also talk about silence, where philosophy of life became a very important topic, with various concepts like ethics, mystical, and religion, the God, or the spiritual, as you rightly said, the spiritual aspect of it. So I think there will be some questions. I now request all the learned participants to ask some more questions. Yes, Professor Ghosh, please. You please, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. One question is arising in my mind, as Professor Pradhan suggested, that we should read Tractatus from the end to the beginning. That means we should start with the mystical, and from there we can proceed to the first chapter. But if that be the case, then it will be, as I feel, is the reinterpretation of Schopenhauer's mysticism, and reinterpretation of Schopenhauer's mysticism in an analytic setup. This is what, and if Professor Pradhan agrees to this, let us hear from him.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh. Really, that is, I made a statement, perhaps it appears to be offhand. But what I meant is this, that if we take the last part of the book seriously, then we can understand much of it, much of the first part. Because if we start with the first sentence and get bogged down with theological atomism and rest of it, then we can never, by the time we come to the end, we think, oh, this is a problem which I think a philosopher just added something mystical to his system of logic and language. And that is what I think that is how Russell really treats in the introduction. Russell is always dismissive of this mystical. As a logician, he thinks this was not necessary for logic, for Wittgenstein, the logician. So as a hardcore thinker, as a hard-headed thinker, he should not have added mystical. But Wittgenstein disagreed. He said he has not understood my book. He always complained Russell never understood him. So that is why I said that perhaps we can go beyond Russell's interpretation, the positivist interpretation of the Tractatus, and go back to the last to see the real wisdom which Wittgenstein is displaying there. Okay, that is where he comes closer to a Plato, who takes us out of the cave and to see the light. So he is, in a sense, not in the he's not happy with the group of these analytic thinkers, logicians. He wants to escape from them. So that was my point. Okay, thank you, Dr. Ghosh.
Thank you, sir. Professor Sarkar has some point.
Yes.
Thank you so much, sir, for your extremely illuminating lecture. I was glued to it like anything. I just wanted to say along with you that if we read the book from the last, it doesn't really, it's not a, it might be seen as a proper way, because the beginning and the end says the same thing. In the preface he writes that what you can talk about clearly, and what cannot be talked about must be passed over in silence. It was in the preface and it was in the conclusion, in the 7th. So we can try to study Tractatus. I think probably Professor Pradhan's intention was to bring to light the holistic picture of the Tractatus, of the author of the Tractatus, which is often overlooked in our syllabuses, university syllabuses, which just end after the picture theory of meaning. Yes. So people don't get the fuller picture, the whole picture. So,
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. May I add just this point that I mean the beginning means first, the first number one. So 7 and first. So of course, preface gives the vision of the whole work. But if we read the first sentence, the world is all that is the case, and the last, all whatever we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. If we start with the last, perhaps that better meaning can come from to the first sentence. So that was my intention. But anyway,
yes.
the point is that we must not get stuck up either in the beginning or middle or up to 5. In 6, we have to go to the last part of the 6, these statements on that 6 paragraph, then we can understand the Tractatus better. That was my point, that perhaps by understanding the mystical, we can be more sympathetic to Wittgenstein's work in the Tractatus. That was my point.
I've got
Thank you.
only that was in support of your
Okay.
explanation.
Thank you.
And I've just one query.
Yeah.
Like I was like I think that if we treat the if we try to attempt to read the Tractatus holistically and taking all these things into account, then probably we'll have to it's better if we distinguish between what can be sayable and what cannot be. So what can be sayable, what is sayable, that is the world. Here the theory of logical atomism is applicable. Like whatever we can talk about, that is ultimately reducible to the logical atoms of language, which correspond with the logical atoms of reality and logical atoms of thought. So there is this coincidence of their limits.
Yeah.
But from the other point of view, it doesn't. Okay, that was my comment on.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Professor Sirola, would you like to ask something?
Hi.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah, please.
Hello, Professor Pradhan.
Okay, nice to see you here. Please.
Yeah, so thank you so much for such an insightful talk. For me as well, this is an important occasion to revisit Wittgenstein. And this is a very interesting title with which we began the Centenary discussions, Symbolism to Silence. And I believe it in a way sums up his work very well. So the title makes me go around Wittgenstein's attempt to collapse ethics and aesthetics, and his distinction between showing and saying, and his conception of the place of silence and nonsense in philosophical thought. So would you agree if we go a step further and call this attempt and his ideas as symbolism for silence? As you aptly brought to notice that his letter to von Ficker, Wittgenstein makes this point, and that his book is basically attempting to make an ethical point. And then he goes, as you said, he could have added an additional sentence in the preface, he says, in that letter, where he could have perhaps, given a key to his work, Tractatus. And that sentence, he says, would have been that my work consists of 2 parts. The one presented here, plus all that I have not written. Now, this is very interesting, and it makes his whole idea and writing quite enigmatic. So von Ficker, he continues this discussion when there is a kind of way in which he says that precisely the second part is more important. Now, if I relate this with his other, statement, where he has said that my book draws limits to the sphere of ethical from the inside, as it were. And I'm convinced that this is the only rigorous way of drawing those limits. So I mostly wonder, when he says that these limits can be drawn from the inside, where exactly this inside can be reached from. So is he trying to suggest that this limitations of logic and language, if we have a clear understanding of, then that gives an inside view? Or is he suggesting that the contemplation of life and its understanding makes us to see the limits of logic and language, and that is what which he is saying is the inside view? So where you think in case of ethics, this inside view is being attempted from the limits of language or from the deeper understanding of life?
Okay, so thank you, Professor Sirala. You are very right that he suggests that we can draw the limit of language from within. That means there is an inside view of language and the world where the limits can be drawn. Yes, that is the way that he has proceeded, but there is also left room for the other possibility that we can, when we reflect over language and world, we are supposed to go beyond language and the world. That means this is what a transcendental view of logic and language can tell us. That is what it repeatedly suggests, that the self is outside the world. The values, the sense of the world is outside the world. That means unless we reflectively, philosophically, transcendentally look the whole world as a limited whole, we cannot really draw the limits of the world properly. Unless you draw the limits of the world, we cannot really talk about ethics. We cannot talk about even God, even self. So in order to philosophically introduce the notion of God, self and value, self and sense of the world or meaning of the world, we have to go beyond the world. So this notion of going beyond the world, though it appears to be some kind of a broad border crossing, but that is exactly what philosophy has to do. So inside drawing of the limit, perhaps could have kept him entirely silent about the realm of the ineffable. That means if you cannot go beyond language and the world, then you can never know what lies beyond language and the world. So in that sense, I think he is recommending, or at least we can believe he is recommending, that we can go beyond language and the world. So in that sense, it is the philosophy which can give us the escape route, not through any empirical experience, not through any logical analysis. The escape route is through philosophical reflection, and one can say that it is a transcendental point of view which can really make this understanding of the world and language from outside the world and language possible. So that will be my idea. It is true, as you have rightly pointed out, that we can draw the limits from within. But what about drawing the limits from without? Did Wittgenstein not try the drawing the limits from without?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Ali, you have.
I have 3 points to make. First one is in agreement with Professor Pradhan. The other two are slightly different in that they seek some clarifications about the points you have made with a tinge of objection. Okay.
Please.
The first one, I agree with you on your point that Tractatus is not a work of realism. It may not be a work of realism. For that, we have evidence in Tractatus itself. when Wittgenstein says in that, if at all the world has a sense, it lies outside the world. So at realistic exposition of world may not have that statement within it. So it shows that your point is well taken. And the other 2 points I want to make are the first is about the privilege you give to the world over language. At some places in your talk, may not be within the framework of talk, but in the general framework of the talk. But at some places when you explain, you give more privilege to the world than language. Okay. My objection is this. You said being of the world cannot be expressed in language. Okay. So language has some limitation with regard to that. Then my question is, can you express the being of world within language? Sorry, being of language within language.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
This is a kind of clarification.
Yeah.
With an intention to object to the way you have put it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
And another thing is this. I'll tell you. You have said Wittgenstein is concerned with the actual states of affairs. Okay, actual states of affairs, and he is not really concerned with the possible worlds. Possible worlds. In that context, maybe you meant one thing. I have something in mind. That's why I'm raising this point.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Even when Wittgenstein talks about the actual states of affairs, he talks about possible states of affairs. You are silent on that, not about possible world.
Yeah.
So it might give rise some confusion. That's why I'm raising this point.
Okay.
These are my points.
Okay. Thank you, Mohammad Ali.
Thank you.
So the 3 points are very important. First one, I'm happy that you do agree that realism may not be the final solution of the language-world relationship that he has introduced. And I said that perhaps an idealistic understanding of Tractatus is possible. So with that, I go to your second point. Really, if I talk about an idealistic point of view within the Tractatus, then I am not privileging the world. I am not saying the world is predetermined or it is pre-given. There is no given world as such. It is a myth of the given, as we know from the history of empiricism. The myth of the given is definitely not in the Tractatus. So world is given in a sense, but it is within the structure of logic and language. So in a sense, I am privileging logic and language. And therefore, really that point, I want to disagree with you that I am not privileging the world. And Wittgenstein himself is perhaps not privileging the world because he talks about the limits and all that. So the point that you have mentioned, the being of the world cannot be expressed in language. That is true. The being of language also cannot be expressed in language. The being as such, let us use the word being in the Heideggerian sense, then that being as such cannot be expressed in language. This can be disclosed. So whether it is a being, my being, or being of the world, or being of language, or being of anything, that cannot be expressed in language. That is what Wittgenstein means in that famous statement that how the world is not mystical, but what the world is mystical. The existence of the world itself is mystical. That means cannot be expressed in language. So on that point, I make the point that any kind of being, for that matter, will be inexpressible in language. So the whole idea of metaphysics of the being in the Heideggerian sense can be called metaphysics, but it is not expressible in language. Perhaps Heidegger also, in a sense, partially agrees that we have to go beyond our ordinary language. That's why he talks of the language of mythology, the language of religion to express the being. Okay, to the last point, I referred to the idea that he is also concerned with the possible state of affairs because he's concerned with how is the world possible in that sense, in the transcendental sense. But as we know that actual itself is a possible world. So among the many possible worlds, there is one world that is actual. So in a sense, his first statement in the Tractatus is about the actual world. The world is all that is the case. That I took as a primary emphasis in his thought, though he ventures into the idea of possible world. And he talks of possible states of affairs and the combination of the objects. So that is also part of his understanding of the ontology of the world. But ultimately, if we talk of picture theory, then he is talking about the actual world. He's privileging the actual world. Perhaps he has Leibniz in mind when Leibniz says that the actual world is the best possible world. Maybe this is the world which a philosopher has to understand, and language is entirely concerned with this actual world. So in that sense, I think you are right in a certain sense that possible worlds must be taken due note of. And I did incidentally refer to it. Okay, thank you, Muhammad Ali. Thank you.
Samasri.
Yes, thank you, sir, for your excellent
Hello.
exposition. Hello,
Thanks.
yeah. And Wittgenstein being my very favorite philosopher like Husserl, I find very uncanny similarities between them when you are talking about transcendental idealism of Wittgenstein. So
Thank
I
you.
can agree with you there. But my clarification is regarding when you are saying that there is a kind of correlation between language and the world. And Wittgenstein is saying that there is kind of imposition of the logical structure of the language into the logical structure of the world. Now my question is, how do we at all then admit that there is a kind of logical structure which is innately present in the language? Is there a logical structure which is innately present in the language? Because otherwise, I do not know whether you can call him, if he is an ordinary language philosopher, like Davidson wouldn't agree with that, because he will say there are certain things which cannot be done with logic or the logical canon. So we have to abide by the natural language. So if it is a natural language, and if we are talking about the world, then the problem is that how can ordinary people be imposing the logical structure of the language on the logical structure of the world? Because one has to have the sense of logic, unless logic is innately present in language. So this is my first question. And the second one is, I think the previous speaker, the previous one who questioned on that realm of unsavory, there I think when he's talking that in language, we can only talk about the world regarding ethics and regarding spiritual things, mystical. We cannot talk about it, but they have to be disclosed. So maybe he's also referring to another realm of thought which cannot be somehow disclosed through language, but in some other sense. I mean, it has to be disclosed, but disclosed through what? If it's not through language, then it has to be disclosed by some other medium. And then is he referring to some language of thought hypothesis that we have? So that is what I
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So as to the first question, he says, though he's concerned with the language that is given with us, he makes very clear that he is concerned with the language. He is not constructing a language. He is not constructing a perfect language. He is talking about the natural language, the given language, which is given as a part of human organism. But at the same time, he says this language has a built-in structure. That is the logical form. That is not imposed. That is which he has to discover from language, discover within language. So he is not, though ultimately it is the logical structure which is prevalent in the logical system of his time, which he is in a sense importing into language. But he suggests that it is already built into the language. Since we have sentences, we have sentential connections, then we can build functional structures, tautologies, contradictions, and whatnot. So these are all part of the general structure of the natural language. So he elevates natural language to a logical status.
So
Rather than
like it's not exactly like Tarski, because that would be perfect language. So this is natural language, but
natural language with a perfect logical
has
structure.
the logical structure. It has itself within it
Yeah,
the logical
he
structure.
justifies the perfection of ordinary language. So in a sense, ordinary language was not something new for his later thinking. It was already with him. Only thing he finds that a logical structure is built into it, that he called the logical form. And philosophy is an inquiry into the logical form of language. So that is how he is starting with his inquiry or critique of language. Second point, I just missed it. Yes.
Realm of mysticism and the spiritual realm, whether it can be disclosed through some other
Exactly.
or whether it can be
it can be shown. As he says, it can be shown. But he doesn't say that it can be shown in a meta language. He doesn't say that. It can be shown. So it is an open question whether it is. So if it is ethics, then it is shown in human life, and if it is God, then it is also shown in human life. And if it is the sense of the world, then it is shown in the world itself. So you have to discern the sense of the world within the world, though the sense doesn't belong to the world. So he is not saying that another meta language we can create. So he is not in favor of a meta language, which Tarski later on introduces. He says this language, either it says
or it shows,
or it either it says or it doesn't say.
Doesn't say.
And that which it doesn't say has a different way of showing itself. So ethics, he cannot divert from life. Ethics and life are for him, though transcendental, but their ethics is expressible or say showable in life itself. A good life is shown in the happiness of the life itself. So I think he has some meaning which can be derived from this, that the showability is not something, another linguistic showability. It is showability maybe
life world, like
something it's showable.
In any sense, in
any
other
sense. It's showable in our behavior, in our life, in our not in language. Of course, if we have a different language, a mythical language or a mythological language, or any other invention of a language, perhaps all of them could make the disclosure possible. Even in Heidegger, the disclosure doesn't happen in language again.
No, it's not.
So it's a disclosure. Truth is a disclosure. Disclosure for whom? To the philosopher, not to the ordinary man. So here also the showing is done to the philosopher himself, to the thinker, to the man who is engaged in this meditation. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Anjanayalu has a question. Anjanayalu.
Yes,
good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good. So please tell.
I have a small clarification, sir.
Yes,
you said Wittgenstein denied the organizational religion, but he accepted religion, and he sees problems within that sense.
Yeah.
I need a small clarification. What does it mean?
Yeah, in fact, there was a doubt whether he was a Roman Catholic, though he was baptized into Christianity. You know, he was born into a Jewish family, half Jewish family. The family was baptized into Christianity, and which Christianity? It was Roman Catholic. So when he died, the question of burial was discussed among the disciples. They said, though he did not believe in going to church and praying there, but he was in a Roman Catholic. So in that sense, he was given burial according to Roman Catholic canons. But the point is that he has nothing to do with any organized religion. His religiousness, if you can philosophically understand religiousness as a separate, distinct category, then this is what he was concerned with. He could not believe. Many times he says, I cannot but believe religiously. And whenever somebody made disparaging remarks about religion, he would caution him that don't to be so foolish to really discard your forefathers. So he had great respect for religion. But the sense of religion, that is more important. The sense of the divine, sense of the higher. There is something higher that he never gave up. Not only in his in the Tractatus, but also much later. He never gave up the sense of divinity. That's why he looked at every problem from a religious point of view. So that way, we can say that he was really trying to understand religion in the philosophical sense, not in the ordinary sense of organized religion. Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
Professor Friedlander, if you have any question. Yes, please.
Thank you. I wonder, first, it was a really beautiful lecture, and I also enjoyed the discussion. But I was wondering about two possible readings of the mystical and how you understand it. I mean, to go is to stress that there is something like a domain or a realm that is beyond language. There are things that are beyond language in some sense, things that are not sayable. And then there's, I think, in Wittgenstein, this other strand, which stresses something like that what is most difficult is just, in a sense, being in agreement with the world. That is, that it's not that you need to go to something mysterious beyond it, but something about this notion of agreeing with what there is really, let's say, the secret of the mystical. And you can see it maybe in the notion of existence. So, existence is what is mystical, the existence of the world. Existence is, an utterly thin or even empty notion. And again, I'm also hesitant about it, but I think it doesn't necessarily lead you to want to go beyond the world, as if there are really there's a doctrine of the mystical that somehow you cannot express, that you can in some other way make evident. And I think the remarks that you made about how a human life, a happy life, can show, as it were, what's missing is again going in the direction that there's a way in which you need not go beyond what's there at the most evident level. In some sense, what's problematic is trying to dig deep, to go beyond, to think that you haven't reached yet what's necessary. So I wonder, between those two views, what would be
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Professor. I do understand that the use of the word beyond can really mislead us into thinking that we are really, in a sense, living the world and living language and going into some, say, mystical place. That sort of misleading impression can arise if I use the word beyond. But the word beyond is also philosophically used, in the sense that when we understand the existence of the world, the being of the world, we are not determined by the factual world. The facts do not determine us. We go beyond the facts. When we understand the sense of the world, the value, the meaning of the world, we are not confined to the way the world actually is. We are, in a sense, going beyond the world. That's why he says the sense of the world is outside the world. The word outside, in the English translation at least, in Peirce and McGuinness translation, outside is suggesting this beyond. But that's not to be taken in the special sense of the term. It means reflectively we are drawing the boundary of the world, and therefore we are going beyond the world. So when you look at the world as he says, as a limited whole, refer to the statement where he says, to view the world sub spec eternitatis is to view it as a limited whole. What does it mean? It is again placing ourselves, at least reflectively, in our thought beyond the world of facts. So by world, he means the world of facts. And when you reflect about the limits of the world, we are reflecting about the limits of the factual world. And everything else, the ethical values, the religious idea of God, can be placed only outside the boundary of the world of facts. So that is what I mean by beyond. Of course, one can always say that we do not, we can understand what is beyond by remaining in the world. But that has another sense. We factually remain in the world. But in philosophy, when we are talking of a transcendental view of the world, we do definitely go beyond the world. So that is what I meant by the idea of outside, idea of beyond, and idea of the mystical. Mystical cannot be realized when we remain in the let us say the Platonic analogy, we remain within the confine of the cave. Let us say the cave is the factual world. Unless we liberate ourselves from factuality, unless we liberate ourselves from the given, the actual world, unless we liberate ourselves, we cannot really understand what is timelessness. He introduces immortality, timelessness, and the sense of God, for example. God doesn't reveal himself in the world. That means in the factual world. God reveals himself perhaps elsewhere, maybe in the human mind, but not in the factual world. So in this sense, I wanted to convey the idea that we can use the word beyond very legitimately within the Tractatus context. Thank you, Professor Friedlander.
Thank you. Professor Yasushi?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor Pradhan. So my question about solipsism, well, somehow it relates to the mysticism. Then, so my concern is, well, so Wittgenstein's monologue, I couldn't find any voice from readers, well, possible readers. So Tractatus sounds like monologue or just single voice, which is quite different from philosophical investigations. Then my question is this: how would you interpret solipsism in Tractatus, and also how would you think, or what would you think about the meaning of solipsism for early Wittgenstein?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I didn't talk about solipsism, though it is a part of Wittgenstein's concern. And there are many statements devoted to solipsism, and he says solipsism is true, but it cannot be expressed in language. And the famous statement which perhaps support his solipsistic approach to himself and the world, the relation between self and the world is, I am the world. Within bracket microcosm, he says, I am the world. So solipsism in a sense is a problem which he struggles with in the Tractatus. But the solution, he says that solipsism, when it is perfectly understood, it coincides with realism. So that is also another statement. And therefore, we have to take all these statements in order to understand what he means by it. But I do understand that he favors some sort of solipsism, because he says solipsism is true, but it cannot be expressed in words. That means it is something mystical. That is, if I say I am the world, and let us take that enigmatic statement very, very widely, I am the world. Does it mean that the individual Wittgenstein, is identical with the physical world, which is not possible? He is not talking about the empirical self, the empirical I, because empirical I is a psychological I, which is part of the world. So it cannot be identical with the world. When he says, I am the world, he says the self is identical with the world. Self and the world are one. That will be the meaning of solipsism. But it cannot be empirical self, because empirical self will be part of the world. In the book, which he suggests, if I write a book, The World as I Find It, he says the only thing will be missing in the world is the self. My body, even he says my soul, the so-called psychological self, will be part of the world. So in that sense, solipsism doesn't mean empirical solipsism or solipsism in the crude sense. Hence, you must look for a transcendental account of solipsism. If we look at transcendentally, then the self and the world are one. How? How can self and the world be one? Not in the empirical sense, they are absolutely distinct. Self and the world are distinct. But transcendentally, if self is real, then could it be different from the world? So that will be the meaning that he is suggesting. I am my world. And he says elsewhere that the world is my world. The world is my world. And that brings the idea of self into philosophy. Philosophy brings self into its domain, because the world is my world. So my world is pregnant with meaning. It cannot be true in the empirical sense at all. The world doesn't belong to me. But transcendentally, perhaps he means that there is no distinction between myself and the world. The world and me. The self in me is identical with the self of the world. So perhaps this will reminds me of the statement which he makes in the notebooks. There are two Godheads, I and the world. Two Godheads, I and the world. There he is making a distinction, that I and the world are two Godheads, and I doesn't, the world, yes, I am independent of the world, there he says. But that is not solipsistic account. But in the Tractatus, he says, I am my world. So in a sense, he's moving towards an identity between myself, self in the transcendental sense, and the world. So perhaps this is how a solipsism can be justified. That's why he says solipsism is true. And elsewhere he also says life and world are one. If we take these two statements together, perhaps solipsism will be one possible way of saying that myself and the world are one. Only an idealistic thinker can say like this: ego and the world are one. A Schelling or a Fichte or a Schelling or a Hegel can say that myself and the world are one, because both are spirits. But Wittgenstein is not saying in so many words like that. But that shows that he is not in the company of the empirical psychologist or empiricist philosopher to support solipsism. He is not, in a sense, a Berkeley in that sense, if we interpret Berkeley as a solipsist. But he is a solipsist in a transcendental sense, if at all we can give any meaning to it. This is how I understand it. Thank you, Professor, for raising this important question. Perhaps in future discussions this will come, and many more thoughts will come. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Associate. Thank you, sir. Now, on last question, Borada would ask, and then we will close. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. It's really a privilege to learn from you. So my question is related to the last part of your discussion, where you talked about that how Wittgenstein is taking the concept of ethics. So you said in your talk that ethics seems so valuable for him that it seems quite difficult for him to allow the logicians to put it in a language. So if so, then language, of course, plays a very important part in our life. And if ethics is a kind of behavior or feeling, as you mentioned, and which Wittgenstein is not ready to put it in a language, then is it possible to talk about an ethical world at all within this empirical framework? And if we are talking about the language, then for Wittgenstein, if ethics can be discussed with the help of other sort of behavior, then language is also a part of human behavior. So why not language? That is the question.
Yeah.
So, and in other, the second query, which I think I'm not so sure, I'm just asking you to get the clarification. In any way, either in the indirect or direct way, is Wittgenstein is taking ethics and aesthetic in the same way?
Yes.
So, if you can explain a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah. The notion of ethics will come again in future discussions also, because this is an important part of it. And in order to understand Tractatus' concept of ethics, we can also read his a lecture on ethics, which was delivered in 1929. So that has the same spirit as Tractatus' spirit of regarding ethics. Ethics is transcendental, he says it. That means he is removing ethics from empirical language, is removing ethics from so-called logical language in that sense. He's removing ethics from the factual world. That's why values are transcendental. Values like goodness, if you add other values like justice, like other values also will come under the category of being transcendental. That means they are not empirical entities at all. You cannot find a empirical equivalent of the concept of good. So that's why Moore perhaps thought it wise to say it is indefinable. So even if you define ethics, then you will define it with something empirical, maybe empirical behavior. But that also will not help us. We cannot reduce good to anything, neither empirical nor even intellectual. So we have to leave ethics to its own realm, in the sense ethics is something valuable and it remains transcendental. It is realizable, it is showable in human life, but it cannot be reduced to any particular action of the human beings. We cannot say ethics is or good is to helping the poor, or good is helping the distressed, because that will be in a sense reducing good to something else. So we cannot talk of good as being reduced to something empirical. So in that sense, we can say ethics has to, or the ethical values have to be remained, have to be taken as autonomous in that sense. Let us not define them, but good can show itself. Now here you have the objection, if it is shown in the human behavior, then is not human behavior itself are you not reducing good to the human behavior? You say that language is also part of human behavior. So in a sense, good will be expressed by language. Again, we are back into square one. That means good anyway has to be chained down to what is empirically available and empirically expressible. That is what he is objecting to. He says, let's not try to try to bring good down to our empirical behavior. Though ultimately he will say that good is expressively human life, that doesn't mean that empirical behavior is the whole of life, because there can be any kind of gap between being good and what is visible in the surface. There can be always a gap. So good remains something supernatural, something divine. He makes this in the culture and value. He makes a profound statement. He says good is something divine, something is supernatural. Don't try to naturalize it. And perhaps this is why he's saying that language is not enough to express what is good. Maybe language will try to express, but it may not be able to express it fully. That's why he says anything that is higher cannot be expressed in propositions or in sentences. So that was his intention. About the second point, can you remind me of the second point?
Yes, sir.
Ethics and aesthetics.
Oh, yes. He says ethics and aesthetics are one and the same. This is only one statement in the whole tractatus, and one has to perhaps write a book on it. But what I mean is this, that both are transcendental. Aesthetic value of beauty is no less profound, no less sublime than the value of good. Good and beauty, perhaps for him, are the same, because he says somewhere else that to view the world, to view something aesthetically is to view it sub specie eternitatis. You can view it timelessly or from the view of eternity, then you can see the aesthetic value of a thing. So is it that is transporting ourselves to another realm of our view of the world. So only from a transcendental or say eternity point of view we can see beauty, not from the ordinary point of view. Hence, aesthetics cannot also, according to him in the Tractatus, cannot be so much vociferously expressed in language. Language must admit its defeat in expressing the good and the beautiful. That must show themselves. So that would be the idea.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now it is time to close the meeting. And on behalf of Forum, I thank Professor Pradhan for such a wonderful talk and opening up the entire corpus of Tractatus and its conceptual scheme. So I really express my gratitude for accepting our invitation and encouraging us to have this lecture series. And everything goes to you ultimately. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
And I also thank all the distinguished speakers who have joined this meeting, Professor Eli Friedlander, Professor Yasushi Moriyama, Professor Bikram Singh Sirola, Professor Priyambada Sarkar, then Professor Marius Bratman. So all of them will be speaking on different dates, and we will communicate to you in advance about their date and timing. So the next lecture will be of Professor Eli Friedlanders. So that is how we'll go. Then other participants, Professor Ranjit Ghosh, Muhammad Ali, Anjaneyalu, and many others who have joined this lecture today. We are really grateful to you, all of you, and we wish that you all be with us for this entire lecture series. And I'm sure with your cooperation and goodwill, we'll complete the series fruitfully. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, Ranjit.
Thank you. Yeah. Nice meeting you. Yes.